Um, my name is Mark Robinson. I'm the Executive Director of the Compact of Cape Cod Conservation Trusts, and I'd like to welcome you to the umpteenth Convocation for Land Trusts in Southeastern Massachusetts. And we don't know exactly when this started. I think it was back in the mists of time in the 20th century sometime. But the whole purpose is to get together once a year, usually on Super Bowl weekend when the Patriots would win, and get together with our brethren and sister from the Cape, the islands, and also Southeastern Mass, the South Coast. We're all preserving a very important part of the world, the Southeastern Massachusetts area, and we can learn from each other through these sessions. This is our first one totally in virtual form. It's a new opportunity for people to tap in that wouldn't be able to necessarily drive all the way up to the Cape Cod Canal where we usually gather. But I think that also the benefit of this being recorded will enable other people to tap into the information as time goes on. I really want to appreciate the help of the Buzzards Bay Coalition, particularly Brendan and Annette, Kat Garofoli, who provided a lot of the admin for getting this session together this year, as well as the Barnstable Land Trusts and their ace Lily, who is helping guide us all to our different workshops here today. So we have a little truncated version of the convocation this year. Because of the Zoom format, we have only have one workshop to go to, but there are four workshops, so you can pick one. You've already signed up for one. You'll be assigned to that waiting room to go and join with your peers. Just to reiterate what's up on the screen, we are recording this. There will be links sent to you by email. Because we have so many people, close to 100 people that will join us, we ask you not to unmute yourself, and it gets very chattery with too many people on mute. And if you have questions, you can chat. There's a chat box at the bottom, and that we'll have moderators during the sessions that will collect those and relay them to the speakers. If you're taking workshop 1, that's the Conservation Restriction Basic Workshop that Vanessa Johnson and I will be leading. You can just stay on this link after the break. You don't have to join another link. You'll go straight into that workshop. The other 3 workshops, there's a second link in your registration email, and you need to click on that second link to go into your workshop after the break. And we're very glad that you've been able to join us. Oh, one further thing, if you need to use the bathroom, it's down the hall, second door on the right. And the pastry cart will be coming through the workshops with fresh coffee and baked goods provided to us by the Upper Cape Tech. So we're very happy to have their support as well today. Without further ado, unless Brendan has something he would like to say, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. Amy Lindholm is the Land and Water Conservation Fund Manager and Northeast Regional Coordinator at the Appalachian Mountain Club. Previously, she worked on the campaign for the Federal Land and Water Fund at the Wilderness Society, and even before that, she was staffer on the Committee on Natural Resources in the U.S. House of Representatives, and she also worked in the Justice Department in the Natural Resources and Environmental Division. She was born in Massachusetts. She has a degree from Connecticut College and currently lives in Vermont. Her title of her talk will be A National Boost to Land Conservation, Full Dedicated Funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. We're very happy to have Amy Lindholm join us today. Amy?
Thanks, Mark. Thanks so much. I'm going to just share my screen so that you all can see my slides. We'll start the slideshow. Great. So thanks so much for inviting me to come and join you today. 2020 was a very tough year. I think we can all agree. There was not a lot of good news to be had. So I'm really thrilled to join you all today to talk about some actual real world good news that came even in the midst of such a painful time. A huge legislative victory for conservation and recreation, the Great American Outdoors Act. On the one hand, it was really truly astonishing to be able to achieve something like this in a year that was marked by social upheaval, pandemic, political polarization, and congressional focus on emergency COVID-related relief for health and economic purposes. But on the other hand, it was really a testament to the power of the outdoors to bring Americans together. Frankly, more than ever before, as the pandemic showed us in stark terms how important nature is to our well-being, and how many communities are actually woefully underserved in terms of opportunities to get outside. So as Mark said, I am the LWCF Coalition Manager at the Appalachian Mountain Club. I've worked for 10 years coordinating the National LWCF Coalition to bring us to this victory. It was a long time in the making. I can't emphasize enough what a big deal this is. Full and permanent funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund has been one of the highest conservation policy priorities for AMC and the broader conservation community across Massachusetts and across the country for decades, frankly. And it's not hard to understand why, since LWCF is the country's most important source of federal conservation and recreation funding. I think many of you are likely to be familiar with this program, but I'm just going to run through a couple of slides to describe what LWCF does and the broader impact that it has. LWCF is an offset. It's taken from, the money is taken automatically from the royalties paid on leases to drill offshore in the Gulf of Mexico and set aside for permanent conservation and recreation access. And so there's a suite of programs that are under this umbrella. It's basically a big, broad toolbox that empowers a vast array of different types of projects. From federal side projects with the federal agencies that save and open up those missing puzzle pieces of our national parks, national forests, national wildlife refuges, and trail corridors. There are state and local grants that expand and improve close to home recreation opportunities, and all kinds of local parks, trails, rail trails, greenways, playgrounds. And there are other grants besides what we call the stateside grants, which are kind of Parks and Rec type of grants. There are a variety of grants that protect habitat, drinking water, keep forests as forests, and support sustainable timber operations, build climate resilience with natural infrastructure, habitat connectivity, and carbon storage. So these are core values for us at AMC, and I know for all of your organizations as well, because access to protected land underpins all of our work. We actually undertake projects ourselves as a landowner up in the Maine woods. So in addition to being recreation users and policy advocates, we also understand the efforts of practitioners like yourselves in rolling up your sleeves to directly protect the places that you love. So just a few examples of particular places and projects that LWCF has invested in, $18 billion over 55 years. Examples of these values and benefits I just mentioned. Cape May in New Jersey is a great example of coastal resilience project for climate change. Drinking water protection, Sterling Forest in New York is a really terrific example of the importance of forested watershed protection. Much more cost-effective alternative than gray water infrastructure for protecting safe, clean drinking water. Rocky Mountain National Park is one of those classic inholdings in a national park. People don't realize that there's so much private land actually within our national parks, refuges, etc. The Pacific Crest Trail, like the Appalachian Trail, is the entire corridor is not fully protected, and that's really important work that's happening across the country, across the national trail system. This is Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens in Washington, D.C. Great example of a city park that is an urban oasis for folks to get away. And from those very urban pocket parks out to the vast wilderness of Alaska. Right here in Massachusetts, we have close to home examples, including Cape Cod National Seashore, where some really critical inholdings were protected. And this other photo is Emerald Forest Borderlands, which is in south central Massachusetts. That's a project that is up for funding right now in FY21. And hopefully will be funded this year and will protect drinking water for Southbridge and other towns in South Central Mass. Massachusetts overall has received more than $238 million in LWCF investment, nearly $100 million on the federal side for acquisition, like Cape Cod National Seashore, over $100 million in stateside grants, and over $35 million in Forest Legacy Program grants, like this Emerald Forest Borderlands project. These are some examples of stateside projects, including the acquisition of 16 acres of riverfront in Mattapoisett, now part of the larger Mattapoisett Reserve. Brendan was telling me about all of the additional investments that were leveraged there in order to create the reserve. It's a good example of how this LWCF money is often like the seed money around which other investments can coalesce, state matching funds, local funds, private funds. This other picture is of Grays Beach in Kingston, a project slated for FY20 funding that will hopefully get underway soon to expand the beach area and boardwalk and construct facilities for visitors. And of course, there are countless urban parks and playgrounds across Massachusetts that have benefited from LWCF. So I want to talk a little bit about how we got to this victory. It was a long time in the making. I've been working on nothing but this for the last 10 years. Because we've established it's a really critically important program. And it's an incredibly successful program. It's been bipartisan supported from the beginning. But nothing is ever easy in Congress, as we know. We've never been able to fully utilize LWCF funds because for the last 55 years, while the designated money was dutifully set aside for LWCF each year, more than half of it was diverted to other unrelated things. So fixing this injustice and unleashing the true power of LWCF has been the holy grail of the conservation community, including AMC, for the last quarter century. And we've finally done it. So it's really exciting. Full permanent funding of LWCF means that the program will automatically receive its $900 million every year. The $900 million previously came in, but it wasn't necessarily spent on conservation and recreation projects without being appropriated by Congress, and that didn't always happen. So now we finally changed that. So I want to talk a little bit about how that happened and the type of advocacy tactics that we use and that we can learn from to go forward with our own work. And I want to talk a little bit also about the opportunities this will open up for folks in Massachusetts and beyond. So the most important part of this campaign has been that the LWCF Coalition is a broad and very diverse group of stakeholders. AMC and other leaders built this nationwide coalition to have very different voices all advocate together, each using their distinct voice and leveraging their work on the ground, like the work that you do, bringing those voices to DC, and leveraging everyone's individual relationships with local partners, with community voices, and with members of Congress to really connect the dots from each unique place to this kind of wonky, intangible program that needed to be reauthorized and fully funded in Congress. And the way we do that, these are kind of campaign building blocks that I like to show people how we do this work. We start by laying foundations, and then we kind of build momentum on top of that, and then look to capitalize on opportunities. So first, you have this foundations column. You have to have this baseline of support and advocacy to educate people and members of Congress and connect those dots between the places in their backyard that they care about and what's happening far away in DC, to provide Congress with the stories of how this program impacts people on the ground, their constituents, and also providing those folks on the ground with information about what's happening in Congress that really affects them directly. So we use local events, site visits, fly-ins where we bring people to DC to meet with their lawmakers, a lot of press, op-eds, social media, to really lay that foundation. And second, you have the momentum that we've kind of built on top of that based on external events and politics. LWCF actually expired as a program in 2015, and we saved it temporarily and used the urgency of that loss or near loss to fuel a major campaign to reauthorize it permanently. And we won on that permanent reauthorization and then used that victory to fuel the next victory on permanent funding. And then this third column shows how kind of we capitalize on opportunities by building champions on both sides of the aisle who are real believers in the program and believers that this is a really good political issue for them. Then when their political fortunes rise and fall, it helps us generate action at the national level. You have some members of Congress who become vulnerable in a close election. You have other members of Congress who may ascend to leadership, and they become really important allies. So we build pressure from those champions and rank and file members of Congress to leadership to get this on the national agenda. And then we watch what's happening overall in Congress to look for packages and moments of political opportunity. Some of the specific tools that we've used in Massachusetts, that was kind of the theoretical framework. This is kind of some tangible examples of the work that we do as part of Massachusetts' overall conservation community, which has been very vocal, and a lot of folks across the land trust community in Massachusetts have been amazing participants and partners in this effort. Really can't thank you enough. As I mentioned earlier, the key to success has been for each partner to use their own voice and leverage their great work on the ground. So we do this by kind of connecting the dots with those local places, which is not always easy. LWCF has funded over 22,000 projects across the country. Every county in America has pretty much been touched by this program, and there's lots of places in folks' backyards that they just had no idea were protected by LWCF. We leverage volunteers and local partners. Our membership, like your organization's members, no doubt, include people who are eager to participate in policy advocacy, especially when it means getting outside. And we use that as a basis for media and digital engagement to amplify the impact. We work directly with our members of Congress. We get them outside, we get them out on the landscape and excited about the outdoors and about the economic impact it often has in their districts. Here's some examples celebrating with members who played key roles on both sides of the aisle. I think you probably all recognize Jim Mcgovern, who first got excited about LWCF at the request of the Appalachian Mountain Club when he came to Congress in 1998, a story he loves to tell. And now as chairman of the Rules Committee in the House, actually played a direct role in helping us get this bill over the finish line this year. At the bottom, you can see an event that we had just recently, masked and outside, socially distanced, with Assistant Speaker Catherine Clark and Congresswoman Trahan at Minuteman National Park. And we work with some great Republicans as well up in Maine, Susan Collins. This is Lee Zeldin from New York. So across the Northeast region, we engage with partners on both sides of the aisle. So kind of bringing that all together, you know, politics plays a huge role. You can't escape that. It's critical to really always be making the case that support for conservation is in the members' self-interest. It's in their electoral interest, because why else do they do anything? That's their job, to represent us and what we want. So they want to hear about that, and they want to hear about how the decisions they make in DC impact the lives and fortunes of the communities that they represent. But I'm very fond of the phrase necessary but not sufficient. All of this stuff, all of this work is necessary, but it's not enough to get major legislation over the finish line. You need the politics to kind of break your way sometimes, and you need a little bit of luck. And you have to be smart enough to capitalize on those moments of opportunity and luck and turn them to your advantage. So that's kind of what happened in the last year or two. We had momentum really building and capitalized to get this major legislation passed. As I mentioned, the program actually expired briefly in 2015, and that changed our campaign a lot. We had to put full funding on the back burner and focus on saving the underlying program. But we used that crisis to build urgency, motivate people with the loss of something that benefits them, and use countdowns to ratchet up pressure. We actually did a year-long countdown called the 52 Weeks campaign, where we did a spotlight on one state per week for a whole year. And that showed what each state had directly at stake, and really kind of ratcheted up that pressure. And it was a great opportunity for engaging with folks all over the country. It was awesome. So that led to our victory on permanent reauthorization of LWCF in March of 2019. We took this huge education effort, huge visibility. There was a landslide of positive press because this bill passed right after an extended government shutdown. And so that created this narrative that, hey, we can still come together. Congress can still function. Conservation is a unifying issue. And everybody can win with legislation like this. So we took that, that momentum and immediately pivoted back to, let's get the funding. Let's get full permanent funding. So we spent months celebrating that win on reauthorization, thanking the members of Congress who worked so hard to get that done, giving them credit at home with all kinds of events and press, while at the same time saying, our work is not done. What good is saving this program if its funding keeps getting siphoned off? So that was pretty compelling. And after a year of making that case and shepherding permanent funding legislation through the committee process and pressing for it to be taken to the floor, politics broke our way with the president tweeting about LWCF, which nobody really expected. A lot has been made in the press and about Republican senators from Montana and Colorado pushing for this for political reasons, and the president supporting it to help them win re-election. And that's all true. You can see it right there in that tweet, exactly what the motivations are. But it wouldn't have mattered if we hadn't spent the last 10 years building that foundation, because it was necessary but not sufficient. So after that tweet, we quickly introduced the Great American Outdoors Act, which brought LWCF full permanent funding together with a major legislative priority of the administration, which was maintenance funding to address the deferred maintenance backlog in the national parks and other public lands. Put those two pieces together in one bill, which was the Great American Outdoors Act. And they immediately put us on the Senate calendar, and I thought that the whole campaign might be over in a couple of weeks. And that was March of 2020, when COVID really shut down everything. So we kind of had to put everything on ice as Congress focused solely on that. But in the initial months of the pandemic, there was emerging fresh evidence of the importance of the outdoors and the crashing of the recreation economy. So that made our efforts even more compelling, frankly. We adjusted our message and pressed on and said, hey, you know, we can do this as part of economic stimulus legislation. It will be a shot in the arm for many communities, and people need the outdoors more than ever. So politics broke our way again, and that argument was accepted, and we ended up, this is the bottom of the slide here, getting on the Senate calendar in June of that year, through the Senate, which was not easy. There were 8 procedural votes to get it done. And we needed not only those all of those Republican champs, but also every single Democrat to be present for 8 votes, sometimes in the middle of the night. So you really had to draw on that strong foundation of relationships. And then on to the House, where of course the Democrats are in control. So it's really important to have those bipartisan relationships and show each side of the aisle how this is a win for everybody. And on to the president's desk for victory after 55 years. So we're celebrating. And we want to celebrate with all of you and show everyone out there in the world who's doing the work on the ground how this can benefit you directly. So what comes next? We're drawing on the lessons of this campaign to guide us forward by celebrating this win to keep the momentum high. There's an increased awareness of the importance of nature for both people and the planet, and so much more work to do. So we really need to reward good behavior and keep lawmakers excited about conservation as a winning, unifying issue. We can't wait to start seeing this money roll out into the ground and celebrate that. But implementation is never easy, and there's a lot of bumps to smooth out along the way. Even under a very supportive Biden administration, we may again have a Republican House of Representatives in 2 years that where there are, a small but vocal minority in opposition to any federal conservation that would seek to undo these gains. So it's really important that we roll this out and keep celebrating it. It's really, really important that we make sure that we get the money in the ground, spend it well, spend it equitably, spend it visibly. It's been a rough transition between the 2 administrations for the Interior Department, and there have been some damaging orders on the way out that now have to be fixed. There are staffing issues at agencies that have had their budgets starved for years. There's a budget crisis in the states, many of the states, because of COVID. So there's a lot of work to do, and we're eager to work together with partners to make it happen. And then we're looking to the future of conservation in the US, and it's all about climate. Finally, it has been recognized that land is our greatest asset in the fight against climate change. So that's going to really dictate what happens next at the federal level. I'm going to just run through some slides on each of these 3 points really quickly before I wrap up. So here's the celebration piece. I've been on a little bit of a victory press tour these past few months. You see Congresswoman Trahan there who did an op-ed celebrating nature and the Great American Outdoors Act victory as a shining light in dark times, which was awesome. We've been doing a lot of virtual events with lawmakers when we can't get together in person, like one we had with these 2 upstate New York members, Brindisi and Katko, and really spreading the good word. We're working on implementation and letting folks know what the opportunities are for them. Basically, LWCF funding is set to double overall. So that's a huge influx of investment. LWCF has always been a very decentralized program that works from the ground up, and the best projects rise to the top. And it's always been way more awesome projects than could ever be funded. So we're really excited to have some of that backlog finally addressed, and for land trusts like yourself to not have to put up with the kind of uncertainty that they have in the past, where LWCF funds fluctuated widely from year to year. Now, not only will they be high at 900 million, but they'll be consistent over time so that people can actually plan and feel confident about taking the risk of undertaking a project that may take months and years to get done. This is a map of current project needs where you can zoom in. We worked with the Trust for Public Land to create this map. If you would zoom in on Massachusetts, you would see places like the Conti National Fish and Wildlife Refuge, Thicket National Wildlife Refuge, at the federal level, and projects like Emerald Forest Borderlands that are forest legacy projects. And we've put together some resources on the LWCF Coalition website that show what the opportunities are. This is the banner from our website at the bottom here on the slide. And there's a page called LWCF Programs that lays out all of the federal side agencies that use LWCF and all of the 5 state and local grant programs and the contact people for each. You guys are lucky to have an amazing stateside coordinator in Massachusetts, Melissa Cryan, who is incredibly accessible and helpful in navigating that process. And she shared some of her insights with me for this presentation. She's really excited about not only increasing the amount of funding per grant, increasing the number of grants, and really broadening the pool of folks who are applying for the grants. Some funds in the stateside program are specifically for state agencies, DCR, DFG. There's grants to municipalities and tribes. This is a really good opportunity for Land Trust to partner with municipalities and tribes to do these projects. The towns have to have an up-to-date open space and recreation plan. And in the past, there were typically $1 to $2 million grants available. That could increase in grants available. That could increase to 7 to 12 million. So it's really a huge increase. That means that overall grants can increase, not just the number, but again, the magnitude of grants. And they'll award up to $1 million for grants that have significant climate resiliency impact. They're also this year giving that bonus level for projects that address urban heat islands. They're really excited to prioritize projects that work in environmental justice communities. And the annual application process, which actually just closed for this year, may increase to 2 rounds per year in the future. So it's really exciting. And then beyond implementing full funding and getting these grants on the ground, we're looking at the next big step forward at the federal level on land conservation after passage of the Great American Outdoors Act. And we saw a blueprint for that in President Biden's suite of executive orders on the climate crisis that were signed just recently, January 27th. There were 3 big takeaways for us in the conservation community. One is that land conservation is being recognized as climate action, and really it's helpful to be breaking down those silos between people who work on climate because they're working on energy and they're working on pollution reduction, and people who are working on climate because they're saving land. So that was exciting. And this is manifesting in a campaign called 30 by 30. So 30 by 30 is a bold science-based vision for addressing climate by protecting biodiversity. To maintain the biodiversity and ecosystem services necessary for long-term sustainability, we have to protect 50% of the planet by 2050 is the scientific consensus. And so protecting 30% of our land and water by 2030 is the first big milepost in achieving that. But we can't maintain support for more and more land and water conservation without addressing equity. The history of land use policy in the US has left a massive disparity in access to nature and all of its crucial benefits to human health and the environment. Massachusetts actually has one of the biggest nature gaps in the country. It's one of the top 10 states that, in terms of the nature gap, with 94% of people of color experiencing nature deprivation, as opposed to just 14% of white communities experiencing nature deprivation. So here you see the statistics in terms of families with children. The first bar here is families without children, and then you see families with children experiencing nature deprivation. So living in areas that are underserved in terms of parks and access to nature. And then you see low income families with children, In the middle here, you see white families with children, and then non-white families with children, non-white low-income families with children. So there's a lot of work to do. And we're excited to do that work. I think the biggest lesson that we've learned from the past few years on the LWCF campaign is that success is possible, even in the hardest times when it seems the most unlikely. So everyone at AMC and across the LWCF coalition is incredibly excited about finally unleashing the potential in this funding. And we hope that it will empower the amazing work that you do, and you know, make that work easier and let you do more of it, because that's what you do best.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. Here we are in our living rooms and dining rooms, from Westport all the way to Provincetown, and it's not quite the same as normal, but if we were all together, I think there'd be a big round of applause right now. That's really helpful for all us to hear that story. Want to remind everyone, yeah, here comes the applause on the chat box. I'm trying to follow the chat box as it'll scroll and get everybody's questions. So if everyone can stay muted, because we have so many people on this session, but if you have questions, throw them in the chat box and I'll ask them directly to Amy. So a question came up about which federal agency administers this program. Is that something that you could address?
Pretty much all of them, which is part of what makes implementation so tricky. It's a very decentralized program, as I mentioned. So each agency has its own land acquisition priorities. The Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Forest Service. So that's not even in the Interior Department, that's in the Agriculture Department, and the Bureau of Land Management out west. And then the Park Service oversees the state grant, the stateside grants program, and then some of the other grant programs like Forest Legacy is overseen by the Forest Service, cooperative endangered species grants overseen by Fish and Wildlife Service. It's very decentralized, so that makes it tricky, and that's why we've tried to put together some resources for folks, which I'm happy to have Brendan share after the event today, in terms of putting everything in one place and telling you where to go on specific projects.
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to keep up with the chat here. A quick question on how we get started to match our project with a part of this program. And actually, I was going to speak up because folks know me as just a very enthusiastic user of federal grants since the very beginning of my career here on Cape Cod at Wacoit Bay. And I think one thing that Amy said is something to keep your mind out. There is this grant program through the state EEA, DCS, just like the land grant program and a conservation partnership program. And there was actually an annual grant announcement. One actually closed this week, but as Amy said, they're looking at having a lot more money, so possibly even having 2 rounds per week. But another thing Amy said, which I think is really relevant to Cape Cod and the rest of Southeastern Massachusetts, is partnering with the federal agency, because there's separate lines of funding for this, not only to the national park on the Outer Cape, but to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, relative to Monomoy, to Mashpee National Wildlife Refuge, and to what Amy mentioned, this great Thicket National Wildlife Refuge, which is sort of just getting itself together, but it's relevant to a pretty big portion of our region.
And it's really interesting because it's a different kind of model of refuge where there's no kind of one big chunk, right? It's all over. It's across 6 states. And so the boundary itself is very loose. And so I think that is a really interesting model for us to look at going forward in the East, where land is so fragmented. If we want to get to a big, bold goal like 30 by 30, we need to think outside the box in terms of how we do conservation, even at the federal level, and the federal agencies need to think a little bit outside the box. And so a refuge like that, which is, not concentrated in one place, but really concentrated on a particular type of habitat, is a really interesting model going forward. And we might want to see more refuges like that.
So one question that came up from Janet Milkman is, are there elected officials in our region who aren't supportive or who we need to work on, which maybe you can comment on that, but also sort of, I'll expand on that question a little bit. Moving forward, are there things we need to be aware of to make sure this doesn't reverse or change, like you mentioned, and sort of how do we look out for what and when we need to act and do something?
Yeah. So, support for LWCF has not ever really been a problem, right? There's very few people who don't support it. There is, like I said, there's a small but vocal minority in the Republican Party who are very anti-federal government in general, and who tend to look at this program and only see federal land acquisition, particularly out west, and hate that. So that's always a risk. The Congressional Western Caucus is always attacking this program. But overall, there's wide bipartisan support. We had super majorities in the House and Senate pass this bill. It was extraordinary. And so with the exception of Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, I can't think of a single member of Congress in the Northeast who does not support this program, Republican or Democrat. However, it's the degree of support that matters when you're trying to get something done in Congress. Congress has infinite priorities and only so many hours in a day. And so our work has really centered on creating the pressure to put this on the agenda. And so for that, you need members of Congress to be very invested. And we've worked hard, like I mentioned, Congressman Mcgovern, getting him invested in this program for the last 20 years, right? To the point where he was shepherding it through the Rules Committee last summer. And so keeping that excitement level high and making sure that this is a priority, that members are willing to make this a priority when they need to and put other things aside. We had to get this bill passed with no amendments, which was incredibly difficult, because even the most supportive allies of us were like, well, this is a great bill, but what can't we put this in, or can't we put this little thing in for my district? And we could make it better by doing this. And we had to say, no, this is not going to pass unless we keep it simple and no amendments. And so it's always important to have all of the members thinking about it and be fostering those relationships, because you never really know who is going to be important when you need them. Who knew in 1998 that Jim Mcgovern would become chairman of the Rules Committee? Now we have members on both sides of the aisle in the Northeast who are in these kind of vulnerable swing districts. So they have the attention of leadership and have kind of outsized voices to use in the process. And so I would just encourage you to build a relationship with your member and nurture that relationship, and get them outside. They love it. It's such a nice break from the other stuff that they do, and they love getting credit for the fact that they have worked for this. There's so many little steps in the legislative process, and we needed members to co-sponsor, so many bills and sign so many letters and so many votes that, all of them have played a role. And the more we can celebrate that role, the more excited they will be next time we need them to do something to do it.
I think that's a great tip, Amy. I have a memory of bringing Congressman Delahunt out to the Quashnet River, and the coincidence of having this big school of herring swim upstream right in front of us, but it certainly made an impression. And if you put yourself in the right spot, there's a chance things like that can happen. And I know folks on the Cape and Land Trust and all our organizations are sort of looking for opportunities to do that, but certainly encourage everyone to do what Amy just said, to build those relationships and nurture them so that when they aren't necessary, they can be called upon.
In terms of knowing when they're necessary.
We're running into the break, so I'm sorry, but what is part of the structure of trying to do this online, we wanted to keep it relatively short.
Yeah.
So we're going to put Amy's email in the chat box so folks can reach out to her directly with any questions. I also want to say questions about accessing money for your projects, do what you usually do, reach out to the compact. Certainly if you have questions, contact any of us at the coalition. Just like the other grants that are available, we'll be keeping appraised of sort of how this develops and how we might be able to direct some of this additional funding towards the projects that you're developing in your communities. So with that, just want to, one more time, a big round of applause for Amy. Thank you very much for taking your Saturday morning to join us and help us.
Thank you.
And